My name is Martha Vance. I'm 70 years old. I built everything I have from a one-bedroom apartment in Flatbush. My only son, Julian, 45, suggested a family hiking trip. To reconnect, he said. His wife Skylar smiled and agreed. They left me on an exposed ridge in a nor'easter. No phone, no coat, no supplies. A note on the restroom door said I was no longer fit to manage my own life. From a stranger's cabin, I found my Ring camera online. Julian and Skylar were in my living room. My wine, my sofa, my home. To Martha, Julian said, raising his glass. May she rest peacefully. The dementia diagnosis went through, Skylar said. POA is certified. She has nothing left to fight with. Julian smiled. Then it's done. I stared at the screen. I couldn't move. I understood it then. He hadn't panicked. He hadn't acted in desperation. He had planned this from the very beginning. A forged power of attorney. A paid doctor. A fabricated diagnosis. My $5.2 million 401k. My estate, my legal identity taken. But Julian made one mistake. I survived, and I was already building the case. Before we go any further, please hit subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you give this a like, good luck is coming your way. He celebrated too soon. The Hampton estate in late October wore its age the way Martha Vance did, with dignity, with intention. With the quiet confidence of something that had weathered every storm the Atlantic could throw at it. The hydrangeas along the east fence had gone to rust and copper, petals dried on the stem like the pages of an old letter. No one had gotten around to throwing away. The swimming pool had been covered for the season. Its blue tarp weighted down with sandbags at each corner, the way Martha always insisted, corners first, then the center, no wrinkles. Everything had a method. Everything had been earned. She sat at the kitchen table with her second cup of Earl Grey, the tea bag still steeping even though she knew better, the tannins turning it bitter if she left it too long. She left it anyway. Old habits were stubborn things, and Martha Vance had long since made peace with her stubborn ones. The 401k statement was open in front of her, 3 pages printed on the heavy cream paper her accountant used for documents that deserved a certain gravity. She read the top line again, though she had read it 4 times already. $5,240,000. 43 years of strategic acquisition, of properties bought low and sold high, of spotting value on blocks that other developers dismissed as dead zones. All of it distilled into numbers on a page. She traced the figure with her fingertip, not out of vanity, but out of something closer to wonder. She had grown up in a one-bedroom apartment in Flatbush. Her mother ironed other women's dresses for a living. Martha still remembered the smell of steam and starch on Sunday mornings, and the way her mother's shoulders curved forward by evening like a question mark. She folded the statement in thirds and tucked it into the manila envelope she kept in the kitchen drawer, beneath the takeout menus she never used. And the birthday candles she always forgot to replace. Then she refilled her tea. That was when she saw it. A yellow envelope, the color of a legal warning, sitting on the marble counter near the fruit bowl. It was addressed to Julian Vance at a Soho address she didn't recognize, with the IRS seal embossed on the upper left corner in that particular shade of government gray. She had barely registered the shape of the words before Julian appeared in the kitchen doorway. Hair still damp from the shower, wearing the cashmere robe she had given him 3 Christmases ago. He crossed the kitchen in 4 strides, his smile arriving a half-second too late, the way a light flickers before it catches. "That's just something for my accountant," he said, sliding the envelope beneath his arm. "Nothing exciting." Martha wrapped both hands around her mug. "The IRS doesn't usually mail nothing exciting. It's an audit inquiry. Routine." He poured himself a glass of sparkling water from the bottle on the counter, keeping his back to her. "They flag anyone in certain income brackets. My accountant says it happens all the time." "Which income bracket?" Martha asked. Julian turned around, and the smile was fully assembled now, the one she had known since he was 7 years old. The one that appeared when he wanted something or when he had already taken it. Mom, let me worry about my business, all right? You've got enough to think about. She said nothing. She sipped her tea, which had gone bitter, and watched him leave the room. The morning light through the French windows was the color of warm honey. But Martha felt something cold at the base of her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. She had spent 40 years reading rooms reading the hesitation in a seller's eyes, the false confidence in a buyer's handshake, the exact moment a negotiation shifted. Her instincts had made her rich. They had never once failed her. They were talking to her now. She gave the feeling its space, the way she had always given difficult things their space, not running toward it, not running from it. Just acknowledging that it was present. Julian had suggested the Catskills trip the evening before, over a dinner of roast chicken and the good burgundy that Skylar had selected without asking. He had framed it as a gift. Skylar wants to reconnect, he said, refilling Martha's glass with the automatic generosity of someone who had been practicing it. She feels like we've all been living in our own separate worlds. She thinks fresh air, a trail, a couple of days away from the city, it would do us all good. Skylar had looked up from her phone at precisely that moment, as if she had been waiting for her cue, and offered Martha a smile that reached no higher than her cheekbones. She was a beautiful woman in the way certain birds were beautiful, vivid coloring, precise movements, an air of self-contained calculation. Martha had never been able to hold a real conversation with her. Every exchange felt like a door that opened into another door. The mountain air will do your lungs good, Mom, Julian added, already reaching for his jacket on the back of his chair, fingers curling around the fabric with the casual certainty of a man who had already decided the answer. You're always saying you want to get out of the city. I say I want to get to the Cape, Martha said. I've never said anything about the Catskills in October. Julian laughed, and the laugh was a good one, warm and fond, the one she used to hear when he was happy as a boy. She felt her chest relax in spite of herself. That laugh had always been her weakness. She had built a professional career on refusing to let sentimentality interfere with judgment. And her entire personal life on letting it interfere with everything. Humor an old man, he said. Just a couple of nights. I'll book us the nice lodge. She had said she would think about it. The following morning, she found Skylar in the sitting room, standing near the bookcase with her phone pressed to her ear. Her voice dropped to something barely above a breath. When Martha appeared in the doorway, Skylar turned in a single fluid motion, and the phone screen went dark before it reached her pocket. Just confirming our reservations, Skylar said, pleasantly. Martha looked at her for a moment. For where? The lodge. A pause so brief most people would have missed it. In the Catskills. Julian said you'd agreed. I said I'd think about it. Skylar smiled again, that shallow, architectural smile. Well, I hope you'll say yes. I really would love the time together. Martha nodded and walked past her to the window. Outside, Julian was loading the back of the Range Rover, carrying gear down from the garage storage with the focused energy of a man who had decided the trip was already happening. She watched him lay a heavy coil of rope carefully along the far edge of the cargo space. It was thick, utility grade, the kind used for rigging or anchoring. Not the kind you brought on a casual autumn hike. She pressed one hand to the cold glass of the French window. The morning sun was strong and golden, filling the room with the kind of light that made everything look safe and warm and completely knowable. She stood in it, and she felt cold anyway. Martha Vance had built her empire by trusting the feeling in her chest before she trusted the words in the room. That feeling was saying something now, low and insistent, beneath the birdsong and the distant sound of Julian zipping up a duffel bag. She couldn't name it yet. She only knew that it was there, the way you know. A storm is coming before the sky has shown you a single cloud, something in the pressure of the air, something in the way the light has changed. She set down her mug on the windowsill and watched her son load the car. The rope, the strange envelope, the phone that went dark too quickly. Trust is a fragile glass, she thought. And she had just heard the first microscopic crack. The Catskills in late October smelled like cold earth and pine resin and the particular mineral sharpness of a sky about to break open. Martha noticed it the moment Julian pulled the Range Rover off Route 28 and onto the gravel access road that led to the trailhead. The air changed quality. Thickened with something ancient and indifferent, the way wilderness always reminded you that it had been here long before you arrived. And would be here long after you were gone. She had driven through these mountains dozens of times over the years, always on the way somewhere else. Always with the city pulling at her back like a current. She had never stopped. The Catskills had always felt like scenery to her rather than destination, beautiful and remote in the way of things that belonged to other people's lives. Now, stepping out onto the gravel, she watched Julian lift 2 packs from the back of the SUV. With the practiced efficiency of a man who had prepared for this, specifically, in advance. The rope was coiled neatly beside the first aid kit. She looked at it again and said nothing. The sky above the ridge line was the color of a bruised purple-gray at the horizon. The clouds building from the northwest in the layered, ominous way that meant serious weather. Martha had lived in the Northeast her entire life. She knew what that sky was saying. "There's a system coming in," she said. "Not until tomorrow morning," Julian replied, without looking up. "We'll be at the lodge by tonight." Skylar was already at the trailhead, adjusting the straps on her pack with the careful focus of someone who wanted very much not to make eye contact. She was wearing technical gear, the expensive kind, moisture-wicking layers, proper boots, a satellite-capable watch on her left wrist. She had clearly outfitted herself for this trip with some care. Martha looked down at her own jacket, a good one but not technical. Her walking shoes adequate for a paved trail but not for serious elevation in deteriorating weather. She reached into her coat pocket for her iPhone, an automatic gesture. The checking-in reflex of anyone who had spent decades fielding calls from contractors and lawyers and city inspectors at all hours. Her pocket was empty. She checked the other one. Also empty. "I can't find my phone," she said. Skylar turned from the trailhead, her expression shifting into something carefully calibrated concern without alarm, helpful without being flustered. "Oh, it might be in the car. Let me look." She disappeared around the side of the Range Rover for 30 seconds, then reappeared with empty hands and a sympathetic tilt of her head. "It's not in there. You might have left it at the penthouse. You had it on the kitchen counter last night." Martha had no memory of leaving it on the kitchen counter. She had a very clear memory of slipping it into her coat pocket when they left the Hampton estate that morning. She remembered the weight of it. She remembered the screen lighting up with a message from her accountant as they pulled out of the driveway. She looked at Julian. He was studying the trail map with his back half turned to her. "We can pick up a disposable at the general store on the way back," he said. "It's not like you need to check the markets this weekend, Mom." "That's the whole point." Martha pressed her lips together and said nothing. They hiked for the better part of 2 hours. Julian set the pace from the front, moving with a driven, almost mechanical energy that pulled them steadily away from the trailhead and deeper into the forest. The marked trail was well maintained near the base, the blazes clear on the trees, the footing firm. But Julian didn't follow the blazes. He bore left at the third junction, onto a path that was less worn, the leaves undisturbed by other hikers, the undergrowth pressing closer on both sides. "The scenic route," he said, without being asked. Martha noted the safe return markers as they passed them, wooden posts with trail distance and emergency contact information printed in weatherproof ink. She counted them 1, 2, 3. They passed the fourth one and she looked back. It disappeared behind a turn in the trail. Then there were no more markers. She was watching the ground carefully, the roots, the rocks, the way the trail grade was increasing when she noticed Julian's backpack had shifted slightly, the side pocket unzipped. A piece of paper had worked its way to the edge, held there by the friction of his arm. As he stopped to adjust a strap, it slipped further. She reached forward and caught it before it fell. It was crumpled, as if it had been folded and refolded many times, the paper gone soft at the creases. She smoothed it just enough to read the header: Notice of Intent to Foreclose Soho Commercial Property, filed September 14. The address was the one on the yellow IRS envelope. The amount in arrears was $460,000. She folded it back along its existing creases and held it out to him. Julian took it from her hand without speaking. Something moved across his face, not quite shame, not quite defiance. Something that had been waiting to surface and had then decided against it. "Old paperwork," he said. "Julian." Her voice was quiet. "That was filed 6 weeks ago. My attorneys are handling it." He zipped the side pocket. "Can we just walk, please?" The wind picked up as they gained elevation, the gusts sliding down off the ridge with increasing force, carrying a damp edge that meant the storm system was moving faster than Julian had claimed. Martha could feel the temperature dropping in real time, the afternoon light going flat and gray, the shadows under the pines deepening. She checked Julian's wrist when he reached back to hold a branch aside for her. His GPS watch was on the device. She had seen him check every 15 minutes since they left the car. It was a high-end model, the kind that tracked your position even in backcountry terrain and shared your location with designated contacts automatically. She saw the green status light on the side, but when she looked at the watch face directly, the location sharing indicator was dark. He had turned off the tracking. Her heart did something she didn't permit herself to acknowledge yet. A slow, deliberate hammering, patient and factual, the way your body delivers information it knows you're not ready to receive all at once. She stopped walking. "Julian." The wind was picking up around them, pressing through the canopy overhead with a low moan. "The wind is getting serious. We should turn back." Julian was already a few yards ahead, not turning around. Just one more mile. One more mile to what? The lodge was supposed to be a 30-minute hike from the trailhead. "We've been walking for 2 hours. He turned then, and something was different in his face. The easy warmth she had grown up with, the sun face. The one that had always made her soften and relent. It was thinner now, wearing through at the edges like a garment that had been washed too many times. "Just one more mile, Martha," he said. She heard it immediately. Not Mom. Not the word she had heard from his mouth approximately 10,000 times over 45 years. The word that had carried every variation of his need and his charm and his apology and his love. Just her name. Her plain surname. The way a stranger would say it. The forest around her was enormous and very silent beneath the wind. The sun I raised was disappearing into the shadows of the pines. She kept walking because there was nowhere else to go, and because stopping in the middle of a mountain trail as the temperature dropped was not a reasonable option. And because some part of her, the stubborn, irrational part that had kept her married to her hope for him long past the evidence, still needed to be wrong about this. But she was not wrong. She had not been wrong since the moment she saw that envelope on the kitchen counter. She understood that now, fully, the way you understand something you have been refusing to understand for a very long time. The trees pressed in on both sides, tall and dark and indifferent. The wind rose another degree. Martha Vance walked on. They reached the ridge as the light died. It happened quickly, the way things in the mountains happen incrementally and then all at once. One moment the sky above the tree line held a thin strip of pewter light along the western edge. The next, it was gone, swallowed by clouds. Moving with the grim purposefulness of something that had made up its mind. The temperature had dropped 8 degrees in the last 40 minutes. Martha could measure it in her body, in the way her fingers had gone from cold to numb at the tips, in the tightening of her lungs with each breath. The ridge itself was exposed, the pines thinning out to scrub and rock, the wind hitting without obstruction from any direction. The view on a clear day would have been extraordinary, she could tell by the geography, by the way. The land fell away on 3 sides in long, forested sweeps toward the valley floor. But the clouds had taken the view. There was nothing ahead of them now but gray-white murk and the sound of the wind doing its serious work. Julian stopped walking. He stood at the ridgeline looking out at nothing, his shoulders set with an odd kind of stillness. as though he had arrived at a decision he had been carrying for a long time and was now setting it down. "There's a trail restroom about 100 yards that way," he said, pointing along the ridge to the east. A wooden structure was barely visible through the haze, a primitive lean-to configuration, the kind maintained by the Park Service at backcountry intervals. "You should use it before the weather closes in." Martha looked at the structure. Then she looked at the sky. "We need to get back to the car," she said. "We're closer to the lodge from here than the trailhead. We use the facilities, rest 5 minutes, and push on." The lie was clean. She recognized it the way you recognize a professional forgery. The proportions are right, the materials are right. But something in the execution is slightly too deliberate, slightly too smooth. "I'm not using a backcountry restroom in a whiteout," she said. "It's not a whiteout yet." He met her eyes for the first time in hours, and she saw something in them she wished she hadn't. Not cruelty, exactly. Something worse, the resignation of a man who has already committed to a course of action and is simply waiting for it to complete. 5 minutes, Mom. I'll wait right here." She looked at Skylar, who was standing slightly apart from both of them, adjusting the buckle on her pack with unnecessary focus. Skylar did not look up. Martha walked to the trail restroom. Inside, it was barely warmer than outside, the wooden walls providing windbreak but nothing else. A kerosene lantern on a hook, unlit. A bench, a plastic hook for packs. She stood in the dim space and listened. The wind, the creak of the structure's timber joints, her own breathing. And then, from outside, a sound she placed instantly, because she had heard it 10,000 times in parking garages and driveways. The double chirp of a car remote locking, followed by the particular low growl of a high-end SUV engine turning over, and then the diminishing crunch of tires on frozen ground. She stood completely still for 3 seconds. Then she pushed the door open and stepped out into the white. They were gone. The ridge was empty in every direction. The tire tracks were already filling with wind-blown snowlight, dry flakes that had begun while she was inside, the advance guard of the system that was now arriving in earnest. The Range Rover's tracks led back along the ridge access path and then disappeared around a curve of land. She could hear the engine for another 30 seconds, growing smaller, and then there was only the wind. She turned in a slow circle. The tree line, the drop-off, the sky, white and close and featureless. No packs. They had taken both of them, including the one with the emergency supplies, the thermal blankets, the water, and her heavy down parka, which she had strapped to the outside of her pack because it had been too warm during the climb. She was standing on an exposed ridge in the Catskills in an October nor'easter in a wool coat and walking shoes. The shock of it was physical, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature, starting at the center of her chest and moving outward. She pressed both hands against her sternum, and the gesture was involuntary, the body reaching for its own center. Then she saw the note. It was pinned to the restroom door with a trail marker pin, a folded square of paper that the wind was already working at. She pulled it free before it could escape and held it with both hands to keep it still. The handwriting was Skylar's, precise, unslanted, the letters formed with the controlled legibility of someone who had written this out more than once before getting it right. "For your own safety and the safety of others, we are filing for emergency guardianship of Martha Vance. Martha has been exhibiting signs of cognitive decline and erratic behavior that make her a danger to herself. We are doing what any loving family would do. You are no longer fit to manage your own affairs. Please do not attempt to find us." She read it twice. The second time, her hands stopped shaking. Not because the fear left. The fear was enormous and very present, sitting in her chest like a stone, but because something else arrived alongside it. Something harder and quieter that she recognized from a long time ago. She had felt it the first time a developer tried to cut her out of a deal she had originated. She had felt it when a bank officer told her that a woman from Flatbush had no business applying for a commercial loan. She had felt it every time someone had looked at her and decided, before she had opened her mouth, what she was capable of. They didn't just leave her to die. They labeled her incompetent to the world. That was the particular genius of it, She understood. If she somehow survived, if she walked out of these mountains, she would emerge into a legal landscape that had already been reshaped. Julian and Skylar would have filed the guardianship petition. They would have the forged documents ready, the medical testimony arranged. The narrative said a deteriorating old woman who had wandered off, who had become confused, who had been gently, reluctantly placed under the protection of her devoted son. Her voice would be the voice of an incompetent. Her testimony would be the testimony of a woman whose mind had gone. She folded the note and put it in the inside pocket of her wool coat, buttoning the pocket closed. She tried to scream. The sound she produced was real and strong. A 60-year-old woman who had never been quiet in her life, but the wind caught it and bent it back. The trees absorbed it, the white sky swallowed it whole. The branches around her cracked and swayed. The forest mocked her with its indifference, with the sound of 10,000 things that didn't care. Martha stood on the ridge in the growing dark. She pressed her lips together. She began to walk. She walked until she couldn't see the ridge anymore. The trail, if it still was a trail beneath the snow, descended from the exposed ridge line into the tree cover below. And Martha followed it by instinct and by the logic of terrain. Downhill meant shelter. Shelter meant survival. And survival was the only problem worth solving right now. Everything else, Julian, Skylar, the note, the guardianship petition, the $5.2 million sitting in a bank account. She could no longer access all of it, would have to wait. The mountain didn't care about any of that. The mountain only cared about physics and temperature and time. The snow was coming in earnest now, driven horizontal by the wind at the ridge and then swirling in complex eddies as she descended into the tree cover. The pines collected it on their branches and then released it in sudden small avalanches when the gusts peaked, dumping clumps of wet snow down the back of her collar, onto her shoulders, into the space between her scarf and her neck where skin was exposed. She had lost feeling in her toes 20 minutes ago. Her fingers, wrapped in thin leather gloves intended for a city in October rather than a backcountry ridge in a nor'easter, had gone through the stage of painful cold and out the other side into the numb gray zone that her body was trying to present to her as tolerable. She knew better. She had owned properties in upstate New York for 30 years. She had heard the stories. Hypothermia didn't announce itself. It arrived the way death did, gradually, and then completely. She found the rock overhang by nearly walking into it. It was a granite shelf, roughly 8 feet deep, carved out by 10,000 years of frost and runoff. The kind of geological accident that mountain hikers referred to as a natural shelter because they had no better name for it. The floor beneath the overhang was dry, or at least drier than anything else in her immediate world, sheltered from the snow by the granite ceiling above. She crawled into the back of it and pressed herself against the stone, pulling her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms tight around her own torso. The cold was everywhere. It was in the ground beneath her, radiating upward through her coat. It was in the air she breathed, each inhale a small sharp announcement of temperature. It was in her hands, which she could feel but not feel, present to the touch, absent to sensation. She held them up and looked at them in the failing light. The fingertips had gone to a color she didn't like, blue-gray at the nail beds, the skin of the outer fingers taking on the waxy, translucent look of something that had lost its connection to the blood supply that kept it warm and functional and alive. She put her hands under her arms and held them there. From the inside pocket of her coat, the one she had buttoned closed, she could feel the hard rectangular edge of her 401k card. She had taken it out of her wallet on Thursday to reconcile a statement discrepancy and slipped it into the coat pocket, meaning to return it to her bag, and had forgotten. The way you forget small things when larger things are occupying the foreground of your attention. She worked it out of the pocket with fingers that were not cooperating properly and held it up. The embossed letters of her name caught what was left of the light. Mountain.I. Vance, $5,240,000. In her hand, in a rock overhang in the Catskills, in a nor'easter that was only getting started. It was a piece of plastic. It was the temperature of the air around it. It was completely, utterly useless. She set it down on the stone beside her. The shaking started in her core and moved outward. It was the body's logic, trying to generate heat through motion since there was none available from the environment, automatic, mechanical. The deep machinery of survival running without her input. She let it run. She had read once that the shaking was good, that when the shaking stopped was when you needed to worry. The light was almost gone. Through the gap at the lip of the overhang, she could see the snow coming down in the darkness, lighter than the air around it. Each flake visible for a moment against the blackness of the trees before disappearing into the white accumulation below. She thought about Julian's face on the ridge. The exact moment he had said her name Martha, and something in his expression had shifted, some disguise. Falling away without his noticing, or perhaps without his caring anymore. 45 years of motherhood, and it had been there the whole time, she supposed. Or not the whole time. There had been a real boy once, a boy who had run to her across a beach with his arms out. Who had fallen asleep in her lap with his shoes still on, who had cried his first real adult cry in her kitchen when his college girlfriend broke his heart, and had let Martha hold him for the only time in his grown life. That boy existed. She was sure of it. She was not the kind of woman who confabulated kindness where there was none. But that boy had grown into a man who had driven away from a mountain ridge in a nor'easter and left her to freeze. Am I just a burden to be discarded? She heard herself say it in the dark. Her voice sounded strange, thin, pressed against the stone, the consonants slightly imprecise in the way cold does to speech. The words floated out into the small sheltered space and hung there. The rock had no answer. The storm had no answer. The useless plastic card beside her had no answer. She sat with the question for a long moment. And then, from somewhere beneath the cold and the fear and the particular grief of understanding what your child has done, from somewhere beneath all of it, something else moved. Something she recognized the way you recognize the foundation of a building you've walked on for years. Solid, below the surface, present whether you thought about it or not. She thought about the hiking trip, the weeks of careful setup, the casual suggestion, the timing, the storm, the route away from the marked trails. The note, which had not been written on the mountain, the paper was too clean, the handwriting too composed. The phone, taken from her pocket, she was certain now it had been taken, that Skylar's hands had been in her coat while she was loading the car that morning. This was not an act of desperation. This was an act of planning. Which meant Julian had looked at his mother, at the woman who had built her first brownstone with blistered hands while raising a son alone after his father's death. Who had never once in 40 years asked him to pay back a single cent of the money she had given him, who had loved him with the specific, irrational, indelible love of a mother who refuses to give up, and he had made a calculation. My life was worth more to them as a death certificate than as a mother. She looked at her frozen hands in the darkness. They were still hers, stiff and blue-edged and temporarily out of service, but hers. The same hands that had poured concrete and signed contracts and held her son when he was small enough to be held. The same hands that had built, from nothing, the empire that Julian and Skylar were at this moment preparing to divide. I am Martha Vance, she said. Her voice was stronger than she expected. It filled the small space under the rock. It went out into the storm, and the storm did not swallow it the way it had swallowed her scream on the ridge. It just existed, a fact in the darkness. And I am not finished. She pulled her knees tighter to her chest and held them there. The shaking continued, her body doing its work, patient and insistent. She held her hands under her arms. She watched the snow come down. Despair was a luxury. She had never once been able to afford luxuries she hadn't earned. She began to think, friends, what a journey we've taken together so far. Martha Vance had everything, a life built on her own terms, a son she gave everything to, and a heart that refused to stop believing. Then she found herself on a mountain in the dark, left there by the very person she sacrificed for. They labeled her incompetent. They took her phone, her coat, and her warmth. They drove away and didn't look back. But here's what Julian and Skylar don't know yet: they didn't leave a frail old woman on that mountain. They left Martha Vance. A woman who built an empire from nothing. And somewhere in that storm, she remembered exactly who she is. Stay with us. The most powerful part of this story is still ahead. The fever came sometime in the deep part of the night, not with violence, but with a slow, dreamlike insistence, the way weather moves into a valley, filling the low places first. Martha was aware of it the way you are aware of things in the space between waking and sleep, where the mind retains enough function to observe but not enough to intervene. She knew she was cold. She knew the rock beneath her was unyielding. She knew her hands were still pressed under her arms and that the shaking, at some point, had gentled into something less vigorous and that this was not a good sign. And she held that knowledge carefully at the edge of her awareness like a candle she couldn't afford to let go out. And then the past came for her, the way it comes when the body is using everything it has just to stay present. She was 28 years old and her hands were bleeding. The brownstone on Prospect Place was going to be beautiful. She could see it even through the scaffolding, even through the plywood sheets covering the windows, even through the layer of construction dust that coated every surface and turned the afternoon light gray and golden at the same time. She could see what it was going to be because she had a particular gift. She saw buildings not as they were but as they intended to become. She had always had it. It was not something she had learned. She had bought the property for $42,000 with a loan her mother had helped her obtain and her own savings from 6 years of work that she did not speak about at dinner parties. She had done much of the demolition herself, not because she couldn't afford workers, but because she needed to understand the bones of the building, needed to know what she was dealing with at the structural level before she trusted anyone else's hands on it. The blister on her right palm had opened again. She wrapped it with the bandana she kept in her back pocket and kept working. The memory shifted. Julian at 4 years old, sitting at the kitchen table of the Prospect Place brownstone, her first brownstone. The one she had kept through everything. The one she had never sold, with a toy truck in both hands, his lower lip extended in that particular expression that preceded a request she wasn't going to like. He had wanted the larger truck, the red one in the toy store window on Atlantic Avenue. She had bought him the blue one because the red one was $7 more, and $7 was a specific amount of concrete reality to her that Julian had never been asked to understand. "I want the red one," he had said. And she had said, "Someday you'll have 100 red trucks. But today you have a blue one, and it works just as well." She had believed that. She had believed that if she worked hard enough, if she gave him enough of everything, the lesson would arrive naturally, that abundance was earned, that nothing that came without effort had any real weight. She had believed that love was sufficient architecture, that you could build a person the way you built a brownstone, with the right materials and the right intentions. What she had not understood, and the fever let her understand it now, with the clarity of something that should have been obvious a long time ago, was that the brownstone had pushed back. Every building she had ever worked on had pushed back, had told her what it needed and what it couldn't support, had imposed its own structure on her ambitions. Julian had never pushed back. She had given him everything before he could articulate the resistance, had removed every obstacle before he could develop the muscles that resistance builds. "I built a kingdom for a boy who only wanted the crown." And then another memory, quieter than the rest. Her late husband, Robert, reading in the chair by the window the way he always read, entirely absorbed, one hand resting open on the page, his reading glasses slightly crooked. He had been a thoughtful man, slower than she was, more careful, constitutionally incapable of the speed at which she moved through decisions. She had found it maddening for years, and then she had found it steadying, and then she had lost him at 61 to a cardiac event. So swift and clean that there had been no preparation and no goodbye, just the chair by the window and then the absence of the man who had always sat in it. He had said something to her once, when Julian was in his 20s and already showing the contours of what he would become. She had been defending a decision to cover a debt. Julian had run up credit cards, something with a car. She couldn't remember the specifics now. Robert had looked up from his book and said, without any sharpness, "Martha, never give the keys to someone who hasn't earned the house." She had argued with him. She had argued with him for years on this exact subject, in the specific key of a woman who had earned her own keys, and could not understand why that didn't simply transfer. The fever thinned. The cold returned, insistent. But something else had arrived in the space the fever had cleared, a specific memory, not of Robert and not of Julian, but of a document. A trust structure she had drafted with her attorney in 1998. At the height of an estate planning run that had taken 6 months and cost more in legal fees than her first brownstone. She had insisted on an obscure provision, one her attorney had thought unnecessary, one she had insisted on anyway because she had once read about a case of family in Connecticut. A disputed estate, a child who had facilitated a parent's death to accelerate an inheritance. The provision was called a Slayer Rule Clause. Under its terms, any beneficiary who was found to have caused or contributed to the grantor's death directly or indirectly was automatically and irrevocably excluded from any inheritance. The estate would pass, in its entirety, to the designated secondary trust she had established for charitable purposes. She had forgotten about it for 23 years. The cold pressed in from every side. Martha Vance remembered. She heard him before she saw him. Boots on frozen ground, deliberate, unhurried, the sound of someone who walked in the woods the way other people walked in their own living rooms. A dog, too, its paws silent where the man's boots were loud. Its presence announced only by the soft percussion of its breathing and the occasional precise snap of a twig. Then a light, not a flashlight, a headlamp sweeping the ground in long arcs, patient and systematic. Martha pressed herself further back against the rock face. "I see your breath," the voice said. It was a low voice, unperturbed, with the particular unhurried quality of someone who had no interest in alarming anyone. "Exhale is warmer than the air around you. Makes a fog. Easy to spot if you know where to look." She said nothing. The headlamp tilted upward, and for a moment the light was in her face, not harsh, adjusted quickly to the side by a hand that understood the gesture. The figure behind it was large, in the way of men who had spent decades doing physical work, not gym-built, just solid, the accumulated density of years. He had a gray-streaked beard and was wearing a canvas work coat, with the practical ugliness of something that had been repaired multiple times rather than replaced. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "There's a cabin 300 yards north of here. Wood stove, water, medical supplies. You're hypothermic. Not badly, yet, but in another hour, badly." He waited a beat. "My name is Elias Thorne. I've lived on this mountain for 11 years. This is Cooper." He indicated the dog, a medium-sized animal of indeterminate breed that was sitting at his left heel with the professional composure of a working animal. "Cooper found you. He's better at this than I am." Martha looked at the dog. The dog looked back at her with the steady, uncomplicated attention of someone who had simply decided she was worth finding and was prepared to wait for her to accept this. She allowed Elias Thorne to help her out from under the rock. The cabin was small and serious, one main room with a wood stove that radiated heat like a small sun. A sleeping loft accessible by a wooden ladder. A workbench along one wall covered in the organized evidence of a man who fixed things rather than replacing them. Everything in the space had been chosen for utility and had been maintained with a care that communicated respect rather than attachment. It smelled of wood smoke and pine sap and the faint mineral note of well water. He sat her near the stove and brought dry socks and a wool blanket and a mug of something hot that turned out to be broth from a mason jar. He pulled from a shelf with the casual efficiency of a man accustomed to emergencies. He checked her hands and feet with a methodical competence, pressing, observing, asking her to move her fingers and then her toes, the practiced assessment of someone who had done this before and knew what he was looking for. "Frost nip on the outer digits," he said. "Not frostbite. You were under shelter long enough. Your core temperature is concerning but not critical. You need warmth and fluids for the next several hours, then sleep." "I need to make a call," she said. "Phone lines are down. Fiber knocked out by the storm." "Satellite internet?" He looked at her for a moment. "Yes, I need to use it. In the morning." "Now." He looked at her for another moment, and then he brought the laptop from the workbench and set it on the crate beside the stove. Starlink connection. She noted the antenna was mounted on the cabin's south wall. She had seen it from outside. He opened the browser and set the laptop in her reach, and then went to the other side of the cabin and made himself useful with the stove, giving her the privacy of his back. Martha's fingers still moved imprecisely, but they moved. She navigated to the Ring app on the laptop browser, logged in with the credentials she had memorized 11 years ago. When her assistant had set up the system and had asked her to choose a password, and she had chosen the address of her first brownstone because some things were worth keeping in your head. The Hampton Estate camera is loaded. The kitchen feed, the sitting room, the entry hall, all recording, all timestamped, all uploading automatically to cloud storage she paid for annually and had never once needed until this moment. She switched to the sitting room camera. Julian and Skylar were on her sofa. Julian had his legs extended on the cushions, her cushions, the ones she had had recovered in a soft sage linen the previous spring. Because the original fabric had finally given out after 20 years. He was holding a glass of crystal, the 2012 vintage she kept in the cellar for occasions that merited it. Tilting it in the lamp light the way people tilted wine when they wanted to signal that they knew wine. Skylar was beside him, her legs tucked beneath her, also holding a glass, laughing at something he had just said. Martha watched them laugh. She watched Julian reach over and refill Skylar's glass from the bottle on the coffee table, her coffee table. Her vintage, her home with the careless, possessive ease of a man who believed, completely and without reservation, that he had already inherited everything in this room. She turned on the audio. The attorney said the surrogate's court filing could be as early as next week, Skylar was saying, running one finger along the rim of her glass. Once the guardianship is established, the 401k authorization transfers automatically. No delays. And the Hampton estate? Once we have legal guardianship, her signature is ours. Skylar set her glass down and picked up a document from the stack on the coffee table. Holding it up, a single page, notarized, with the heavy official formatting of a legal instrument. The POA was notarized in August. The notary was, her voice dropped, and Martha couldn't catch the name. Let's just say she was well compensated. Julian laughed. The dementia narrative worked perfectly. Dr. Hewitt was very understanding. He's very well paid, Skylar said, and laughed too. And she has no phone, no witnesses, and no way to tell anyone anything that doesn't sound like a confused old woman who wandered off a trail. She raised her glass. To Martha. Julian raised his. To Martha. May she rest peacefully. Martha sat with the wood stove's heat on her left side and the laptop's cold light on her face and watched her son drink to her death. She felt a number of things in rapid sequence. The way you feel things when the reality you have been building toward finally arrives. And turns out to be exactly what you feared it was. Grief was there, but brief, a flash, acknowledged and set aside. Anger was there, deeper and more durable. The clean burning kind that doesn't consume itself but holds steady. And beneath both of them, something harder and more useful: clarity. She reached forward and clicked record on every active feed. The system automatically timestamp encrypted all recordings to cloud backup. She verified the upload status active, syncing, the green indicator steady. Then she opened a second window and logged into her online banking. The 401k showed 3 unauthorized withdrawal attempts in the past 48 hours, each one blocked by the dual authorization protocol she had set up in 2019 when a phishing attempt had made her cautious. Julian hadn't known about the dual authorization. He had assumed that with her phone gone, no second authentication could be completed. She had the laptop now. She began documenting every timestamp, every figure, every withdrawal attempt, with the originating account details attached. She moved through it with the focused efficiency of a woman who had been doing financial documentation for 4 decades. Precisely, completely, leaving nothing open to interpretation. They are celebrating a funeral for a woman who is currently sharpening her axe. She worked until the fire in the stove needed feeding, and then she called to Elias Thorne across the cabin. I'm going to need a few more hours, she said. He put another log on the fire without turning around. I've got plenty of wood, he said. She told him, eventually. Not everything, but enough the way you tell a wilderness medic the nature of the injury so they can treat it properly. He listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged, his hands continuing to work at whatever he was repairing on the workbench. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need?" She told him. He nodded once. "Martha Vance died on that mountain," she said. For now, he looked at her across the room with the direct, unadorned expression of a man who had spent 11 years not saying things that didn't need to be said. "All right," he said, and poured her more broth. The Manhattan Surrogates Court sat on Chambers Street with the deliberate gravity of a building that had been designed to communicate finality. Gray granite, deep-set windows. The kind of architecture that told you, before you had walked through the door, that what happened inside it was permanent. Martha had appeared before the Surrogates Court twice in her professional life. Both times in estate matters related to properties she had purchased from heirs who couldn't agree on distribution. Both times she had come prepared. Both times she had prevailed. She stood on the sidewalk outside at 842 on a Tuesday morning in late November and looked at the building. She was wearing the charcoal wool suit she had purchased in 1997. And maintained with the ferocious care she applied to everything she intended to keep indefinitely. Her hair was set. Her shoes were the good ones. She was carrying a leather portfolio that Elias Thorne had driven to the Woodstock print shop to have bound after she had spent 4 nights at the satellite laptop assembling its contents. She was also carrying a second phone, purchased 2 weeks ago under a name that was not hers. Because a woman who was legally dead needed to be careful about her digital footprint until she was ready to be alive again. She pushed through the door. The guardianship hearing for Martha Vance was calendared for 1000 a.m. in courtroom 4B, filed under the petition of Julian Vance and Skylar Vance, attorneys of record listed as a firm from White Plains that Martha had never heard of. She had obtained the filing number through a court clerk contact she had maintained for 20 years. A woman who owed her a significant personal favor and had been willing to look up a case number without asking questions she had been warned not to ask. She arrived in the corridor outside 4B at 9:55. Through the small square window in the courtroom door, she could see the back of Julian's head, his hair recently cut, his suit excellent, his posture carrying the rehearsed confidence of a man who had prepared for this moment and expected it to go the way prepared moments went. Beside him, Skylar sat with a leather portfolio of her own in her lap, her back perfectly straight, her hands folded. Their attorney was a compact man in his 50s with the kind of practiced stillness that came from billing at $400 an hour. At the petitioner's table, a legal aid attorney who had been appointed to represent Martha's interests sat alone, looking through papers with the harried focus of someone managing too many cases, not aware that the person whose interests she was representing was standing 30 feet away in a courthouse corridor. The judge, Honorable Patricia Whalen, a woman Martha recognized from bar association events in the 90s. Known for precision and intolerance for procedural nonsense, was already on the bench, reviewing documents through reading glasses that had slipped to the end of her nose. Julian said something to his attorney and they both laughed quietly at the petitioner's table. A brief shared amusement between men who believed the outcome was already determined. Martha opened the courtroom door. The sound of her heels on the marble floor was not loud, but the room was quiet, and in a quiet room, purposeful footsteps carry. Julian heard them. She saw his spine straighten incrementally, the instinctive physical response to an unexpected sound in a place where you expected no surprises. He turned. The color left his face so completely and so quickly that it was like watching a tide go out. Skylar turned a half-second later. Whatever expression she had been maintaining dissolved into something unmanaged and raw for exactly 1 moment before she recovered. But 1 moment was sufficient. Judge Whalen had seen it too. "Ma'am," the judge said, her reading glasses now fully up on her nose, her attention sharpened. "Can I help you?" My name is Martha Vance, Martha said, walking forward. I'm the subject of this proceeding. I understand I'm a few minutes early. The silence in the courtroom had the quality of held breath. Julian's attorney rose from his chair. Your Honor, the petitioner's position is that Mrs. Vance is not competent to. The petitioner's position, Judge Whalen said, with a quality in her voice that closed the sentence before it was finished, has not yet been established by this court. Mrs. Vance, she gestured to the petitioner's table. Please be seated. Martha sat. The legal aid attorney beside her turned, opened her mouth, and then simply looked at her, with the expression of someone who had been handed a situation that was well outside her standard caseload and was deciding how to proceed. Martha set the portfolio on the table between them. I have materials for the court, Martha said. I'd like to submit them. The portfolio contained 43 pages. The first section ring camera footage, time-stamped and cloud authenticated, documenting Julian and Skylar Vance in the Hampton estate after the date of Martha's alleged disappearance, discussing the guardianship petition, referencing the forged power of attorney, specifying by name the notary they had bribed and the physician they had paid to construct the cognitive decline narrative. The second section, digital records from Martha's online banking showing 3 unauthorized withdrawal attempts against the 401k, originating from an account registered to Skylar Vance's personal holdings company, all 3 blocked by the dual authorization protocol. The third section, a copy of the note left on the trail restroom door, photographed and submitted, along with a forensic handwriting analysis that Elias Thorne had helped her arrange through a contact at a state university. A retired document examiner who had confirmed the handwritings matched to a sample of Skylar's signature obtained from publicly filed legal documents. The fourth section, a chronological account of the events of October 26 through 28, written in Martha's own hand, notarized by an attorney in Kingston, New York on the morning of October 29, 3 weeks before this hearing. The fifth section, the trust document, specifically flagged to the Slayer Rule Clause. Judge Whalen read in silence for 11 minutes. The courtroom remained still. Julian's attorney attempted twice to interject and was stopped both times with a single raised finger that required no further elaboration. Julian himself sat without moving. He was not looking at the judge, or at his attorney, or at the portfolio. He was looking at his hands on the table in front of him. Skylar was whispering to the attorney on her right, rapid and urgent, and the attorney was not whispering back. When the judge set down the final page, she removed her reading glasses entirely and placed them on the bench. She looked at the room over the tops of them, with an expression that had gone past professional composure into something that was simply, plainly, a human response to what she had just read. Today, Martha said quietly, the court wrote in ink what my heart had been shouting in silence. Judge Whalen looked at her for a moment. Then she turned to the bailiff at the side of the room. What followed was not dramatic, in the way that true institutional consequences rarely are. There was no shouting, no theatrical confrontation. There was the judge's voice, measured and final. There were the words fraud upon the court and criminal referral and immediate detention pending arraignment. There were 2 additional bailiffs, who appeared from the side door with the quiet efficiency of people who had been called in advance. Julian stood up. Mom, his voice broke on the word, and it came out the way it had once come out in her kitchen when he was 23 and heartbroken, cracked open, stripped of everything except what was underneath. Mom, please. I can explain. I was in debt. We were desperate, Skylar said. Martha stood. She picked up her portfolio from the table, straightened the edges of the pages against the surface with 2 precise taps, and slid it into her bag. She turned and looked at her son. He was crying. Real tears. She could tell the difference, after all these years, between Julian's performed emotion and the thing itself. These were real. His face had collapsed into something young and frightened and genuinely sorry, and she recognized him in it, the boy from the kitchen. The boy from the beach, the boy who had run to her with his arms out. She stood with that for a moment. I know you were desperate, she said. And she meant it. She understood debt and fear and the specific terror of a life built on borrowed foundations. She was not without compassion for what it felt like to be standing in that particular darkness. "But you left me on a mountain in a blizzard," she said, "and waited for the snow to bury me." She turned her back. Behind her, she heard the bailiff's voice giving Julian the procedural information about what came next. She did not turn around again. At the back of the courtroom, she stopped beside the clerk's desk and removed a key from her coat pocket, the key to the 45th floor penthouse on the Upper East Side, where Julian and Skylar had been drinking her crystal and planning her legal erasure. She set it on the desk. "Please notify the shelter program at the Hudson Guild," she said to the clerk, who was staring at her with the wide, slightly stunned expression of a person who would be telling this story for the rest of their career. "I'd like to make a donation. The property address is on the key fob." She walked out of the courthouse and into the November air. By the time the mountain laurel bloomed in the Catskills, Martha was 71 years old, and the thing she noticed most about 71 was how much lighter it felt than 70 had. The cabin that Elias had built over 11 years of solitary and deliberate labor was not large, but it was right. That was the only word that applied to it. The way you said something was right. When you meant it fit its purpose without excess or deficiency. The way her best properties had always been right when the renovation was done. When you walked through and understood that everything was in the place it was supposed to be. The Catskills Foundation for Wilderness Rescue had been his operation first. His solitary, unannounced, and largely unknown practice of monitoring backcountry conditions and pulling foolish or unlucky people out of situations they hadn't prepared for. He had been doing it for 11 years without funding, without recognition, without any particular desire for either. He had done it because he had the skills and the location and the time, and because people died on that mountain when no one was paying attention. Martha had spent the winter paying attention to it. The foundation's organizational structure was now formally incorporated, tax-exempt, and in possession of a 3-year operational budget that would cover 2 additional search and rescue personnel, a fleet of all-terrain vehicles, a satellite communication upgrade, and the kind of insurance and certification structure that would allow them to expand their service area to 3 adjacent wilderness zones. She had done the work herself, because she did not hand things she cared about to other people to build. She built them, and then she handed them off when they were structurally sound. Elias had watched this process from the other side of the cabin, occasionally providing the kind of feedback that came from 11 years of understanding exactly what the mountain required and what it would not tolerate. He was a good thinking partner, as it turned out, unhurried, inclined toward precision, constitutionally resistant to optimism that wasn't grounded in physical reality. She had not met many people like that. She found it restful. The letter came on a Thursday in April, forwarded from the Hampton estate address to the post office box in Woodstock that she had established as her working address. She recognized Julian's handwriting on the envelope, the deliberate, slightly over-formal cursive that he had developed at the boarding school she had paid for, the one that had been, in retrospect, a place where a boy could learn to perform sophistication without acquiring judgment. She held it for a moment, standing at the cabin's kitchen table with the morning light coming through the east window in long flat bands across the pine floor. Cooper was asleep near the wood stove, one ear twitching in whatever dogs dream about. Outside, the sound of the Catskills in spring water moving under the last of the snowmelt. The first serious birdsong of the season, the world reassembling itself from what winter had disassembled. She read the postmark Otisville Correctional Facility. His arraignment had resulted in a plea agreement. His attorney had negotiated it down from the full range of charges, which was what attorneys were paid to do, and the sentence had been handed down in February. His attorney had sent her the notification as required by the victim notification protocol she had registered for. She had read it at this same table, with the same morning light. She opened the letter. "Dear Mom," it began. "I know you might not read this. I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. I don't have a right to ask you for anything after what I did. But I'm asking anyway, because I don't have anything left except asking." She read to the bottom. It was, She admitted to herself, not the letter of a man performing remorse. She had read enough performed remorse in her professional life to recognize the real thing. It had a different texture. Less smooth, more ragged at the edges, the way genuine feeling tends to be because it hasn't been prepared. He wrote about the boarding school, which surprised her. He wrote about his father's death, which had happened when Julian was 15, which she had always known. Had affected him but had not known how deeply because 15-year-old boys did not explain how deeply they were affected. He wrote about the debt, the real amount, not the amount the attorneys had documented, which was somewhat larger, and about Skylar, and about the specific moment, which he named precisely, when he had stopped thinking of his mother as his mother and started thinking of her as an asset. She stood at the table for a long time. Then she folded the letter carefully along its original creases and carried it to the wood stove. She opened the grate. The fire inside was low but holding banked coals, orange-gray, the patient residual heat of the morning's fire. She held the folded letter over the opening and let it go. She watched it catch and burn. The new will had been executed in January, drafted by an attorney she had worked with for 20 years and trusted absolutely. The language was precise and the provisions were complete, and Martha had reviewed every clause herself before signing, because she did not sign things she had not read, a practice she had maintained since her second year in real estate and intended to maintain until the day she could no longer hold a pen. The primary beneficiary was the Martha Vance Trust for Elder Financial Justice, a private charitable foundation focused on providing legal resources and financial recovery support to victims of elder financial abuse. The Hampton estate would serve as its operational headquarters. The Manhattan properties would be liquidated over a 10-year period and the proceeds directed to the trust's endowment. The secondary beneficiary, for a specific and carefully chosen portion of the estate, was the Catskills Foundation for Wilderness Rescue. The Slayer rule clause remained in place. She had asked the attorney about removing it, and the attorney had said it was generally standard practice to maintain such clauses indefinitely. And Martha had said she agreed with that position. She had signed her name on the signature line. Her signature had always been legible. She had insisted on that, in the era when signatures still carried the weight of identity. Martha Vance. The E was for Eleanor, her mother's name, the woman who had ironed other women's dresses and sent her daughter to school in pressed clothes every morning. With the specific ferocity of a person determined to give a child what she herself had not been given. She looked at the signature for a moment after the pen left the page. It was hers, every letter of it. The evening Elias suggested they walk down to the south, overlook the one with the long view of the valley floor and the river. Catching the last light, Martha was in the middle of reviewing the foundation's Q2 projection documents and would normally have said, "Not yet, give me another hour." But the mountain laurel was blooming on the south slope, the white and pink clusters visible even from the cabin window, and Elias, who was not a man who made casual suggestions, had said it was worth seeing. She put down the papers. They walked down through the pines in the late afternoon, the air full of the particular freshness of a May evening in the mountains. Clean and cool and lightly fragrant with something she couldn't name exactly, only knew as the smell of things beginning again. At the overlook, the valley was spread below them in the long, golden light of the hour before sunset. The river catching the color and throwing it back, the forested ridges going dark in sequence from east to west as the light moved. A hawk was working the thermals above the far tree line, riding the air with the effortless confidence of something that had never once doubted its right to be exactly where it was. Martha took a breath of the air. Her lungs filled completely, without the tightness that had sat in her chest for, she realized now, years longer than she had named it to herself. At 71, she said, to no one in particular, to the valley and the river and the hawk working the thermals above the ridge. I finally learned that starting over isn't failure. It's freedom. Elias stood beside her, looking at the same valley, his hands in his pockets. Cooper sat between them, also looking at the valley, with the philosophical composure of a dog who had learned, through long experience, that the best things required waiting for. The light moved across the mountain. Martha Vance stood in it, and felt, for the first time in years, the particular and irreplaceable sensation of signing her own name and having it mean exactly what she intended. Friends, how did you find today's story? Martha Vance walked into these mountains with everything she had built, and almost none of it came home with her. Not the estate, not the bank accounts, not the son she had given her life to raising. What came home was something she had carried the whole time without knowing its full value herself. Her clarity, her refusal to be finished. There's a question this story asked me that I keep coming back to: how much do we give, and to whom, and why? Martha gave everything. She gave money and homes and opportunities, and the particular, inexhaustible generosity of a woman who remembered where she came from and believed that love meant removing every obstacle. She was not wrong to love that way. She was only wrong to believe that what she gave would be received the way it was offered. What she learned on that mountain in the cold and the dark, with no phone and no supplies and a note pinned to a door telling her she was incompetent, was that she had never been what that note claimed. She had been an inconvenience. She had been an asset to be converted. She had been labeled, efficiently and legally, in the language of a system that could be forged and manipulated. And she refused to be any of those things. She walked out of that mountain not as a victim, not as a survivor, but as Martha Vance, the woman who built her first property with blistered hands, who raised a child alone, who signed every document herself and never gave the keys to anyone who hadn't earned the house. There are Marthas in the world right now. Some of them are watching this. Some of them gave everything to someone who took it, and they're sitting somewhere wondering if what's left of their life is enough to build something new with. It is. I promise you it is. Starting over at 70 is not failure. Starting over at any age, with whatever you have left, in whatever direction still feels true, that is not failure. That is the most dignified, most courageous, most utterly human thing any of us can do. I hope Martha's story brought you something today. I hope it brought you the specific, private feeling of a person who has been seen. If it did, if this story reached you the way I hope it did, please subscribe and hit that like button. We'll be back very soon with another story worth your time.